Hello, economics students. In our last lesson, we ended with the slide that I've got up here right now, and the very last thing we talked about and why we trade with other nations is the idea of specialization. And I want to address that a little bit more in greater detail today, so let's go ahead and get started. Specialization, a closer look. Let's say we have two products, salmon and coffee, and we have two countries, the United States and Brazil. The United States can produce 5 pounds of salmon in 1 hour, and the United States can produce 1 pound of coffee in 1 hour. Brazil, on the other hand, can produce 1 pound of salmon in 1 hour and 5 pounds of coffee in 1 hour. So our total production without trade is 6 pounds of salmon and 6 pounds of coffee with 4 hours of labor. So who has the advantage in salmon production? Well, if you look at it, we can produce 5 pounds of salmon in an hour, Brazil only 1 pound. The United States has an advantage in the production of salmon. It makes sense then for the United States to focus on salmon. On the other hand, the United States can only produce 1 pound of coffee in an hour, where Brazil can produce 5 pounds of coffee. It would make sense for Brazil to focus on coffee rather than salmon, and we would produce salmon rather than coffee. It makes sense for the United States to focus on what it does the best. It makes sense for Brazil to focus on what it does the best, and then the United States and Brazil can trade. That gets us to the idea of absolute advantage. In the example I just gave you, the United States has the absolute advantage in the production of salmon. Brazil had the absolute advantage in the production of coffee. Absolute advantage is the ability to produce more of a given product using a given amount of resources. And this was an idea that was really originated, at least first expressed verbally in writing, by Adam Smith back in the 1700s. And he was wondering why it was that the United Kingdom imported wine from Spain and Italy, and yet the United Kingdom exported grains to Italy and Spain. And of course the reason being that the UK had a much better advantage, an absolute advantage in the production of grain, whereas the climate and resources of Spain and Italy gave them the absolute advantage in the production of grapes and therefore wine. However, a later economist came up with the idea of comparative advantage. It's not really who has the absolute advantage in a product, which should designate what they choose to focus on, but who has the comparative advantage. That is, the ability to produce a product with the lowest opportunity cost. And this idea was developed by an economist named David Ricardo. This is the third economist whose name I would like you to know, David Ricardo, who developed the theory of comparative advantage. The other two economists, of course, are Adam Smith and John Maynard Keynes, the father of fiscal policy. So let's get into this idea of comparative advantage a little bit more in depth, because this is really the meat of why we trade what we trade. Okay. Let's look at the United States and Brazil again. The United States, we're changing our products a little bit. We can produce 100 tons of corn in 2 hours and 50 TVs in 2 hours. The Brazil, on the other hand, can produce 25 tons of corn in 2 hours and 25 TVs in 2 hours. Notice that the United States has the absolute advantage in both corn and TVs. Okay? U.S. absolute advantage in both. So, U.S. absolute advantage in corn, absolute advantage in TV. But let's look at the opportunity cost. What's the opportunity cost of the United States to produce one TV? Well, to produce one TV, I'm going to look at the ratio here, 50 to 100. So one TV would have an opportunity cost of 2 tons of corn in this scenario. Whereas for Brazil, one TV has an opportunity cost of 1 ton of corn. So why is that important? Well, let's take a look. Oh, I'm going to go back to that slide. Sorry. This is important because although the United States does have the absolute advantage in both corn and TV, Brazil has a comparative advantage in TVs. They give up less corn to produce TVs than the United States. On the other hand, the United States gives up less TVs than Brazil does in the production of corn. So the United States has the comparative advantage in corn, But Brazil, giving up less corn than the United States to produce TVs, they would have the comparative advantage in the production of TVs. It costs them less to produce TVs than it does the United States. It costs the United States 2 tons of corn to produce one TV. It costs Brazil only 1 ton of corn to produce one TV. So Brazil should focus on TVs with the comparative advantage there, and the United States should focus on corn. Let's take another look. USA and Iceland. The USA can produce 35 tons of wool in one resource unit. It doesn't matter what that unit. It can be work hours, it can be, capital, it can be any unit, but one resource unit, 35 tons of wool. Iceland can produce 31 tons of wool in one resource unit. The USA does have the absolute advantage in wool production over Iceland. USA can produce 500 gallons of milk with one resource unit. Iceland, 380 gallons of milk with one resource unit. The USA again has the absolute advantage in the production of milk. But I want to calculate the comparative advantage. And to do the comparative advantage, we have to do a little bit of math. We're going to take, if I want to know what the comparative advantage is in wool, wool is going to be in the denominator of a fraction. I'm going to take milk divided by wool, and that's going to give me the comparative advantage of wool. Okay, so let's take a look and see how this works. Okay, again, I'm looking at comparative advantage in wool. 500 gallons of milk is what the USA can produce. The USA can produce 35 tons of wool. So 500 divided by 35 equals 14.3. That means that for every ton of wool that the United States manufactures, we will give up 500 gallons of milk. That is, the resources that we use for a ton of wool could be used to make 14.3 gallons of milk. Okay, so let's look at what that's going to work out for Iceland. We're going to say 380 gallons of milk, which is what Iceland can produce, divided by 31 tons of wool, and that gives us 12.3. What this means is that for every ton of wool that Iceland produces, they have to give up 12.3 gallons of milk. That is, they're using their resources for wool instead of milk, so to do that, they're giving up that much milk. Notice what's happening here. The United States, to produce the wool, has to give up 14.3 gallons of milk. Iceland, to produce the wool, only has to give up 12.3 gallons of milk. Sorry about that. 12.3, of course, is a smaller number than 14.3. Therefore, Iceland has to give up less to produce wool than the United States does. Iceland's opportunity cost for 1 ton of wool is 12.3 gallons of milk. Iceland has the comparative advantage in the production of wool. They give up less stuff than the United States does. And one way to look at this, you can say it costs Iceland less to make wool than it costs the United States. Take away the word milk in this, and you could just say it costs Iceland $12.3 to make wool. It costs the United States $14.3. It's more expensive for the United States to make the wool, therefore Iceland should do it. Okay? Let's look at the opposite side of the equation. Let's look at milk. Okay, I'm going to take, again, I'm interested in milk, so milk is going to be in the denominator on the bottom of the fraction. So 35 tons of wool divided by 500 gallons of milk equals 0.07. The opportunity cost for the United States to produce a gallon of milk is 0.07 tons of wool. For Iceland, I'm going to go 31 tons of wool divided by 380 gallons of milk equals 0.08. In other words, for every gallon of milk that Iceland has to make, they're going to give up 0.08 tons of wool. Notice that the number here is smaller for the United States. The United States gives up less to make milk than Iceland does. Therefore, the United States has the comparative advantage in the production of milk. Okay, this is a really important concept to get because you have to do the math and you have to understand the math. But comparative advantage is really the key to trade. We want to trade what we have the comparative advantage in, not what we have the absolute advantage in. You take a country like the United States, we have an absolute advantage in the production of a lot of stuff. We just have, we're blessed with a great climate most of the time. We're blessed with great resources. We have the most productive land. We have great capital. We can do far better in making almost anything than most countries of the world. However, we don't want to make everything. We want to make what we do best, and then we can export the excess of what we do the best and import then things that other countries, even though we could make more of it, other countries give up less to make it. We should import from those countries that have the comparative advantage in those products. We could make more shirts in the United States than Vietnam or Bangladesh. We have the resources to do better than them, but they have the comparative advantage in making the shirts. We should focus on what we make better than anyone else. We should focus our manufacturing resources not on the production of textiles and shirts, but on the production of highly expensive, intricate machinery, optics, medical equipment, the things that you use to manufacture automobiles and airplanes. That's what we should focus on, because that has the greater value than shirts. Okay, we want to focus on that because our comparative advantage is there. We will make more money making those things than we would making something like shirts that's a relatively low technological type of product. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, I want you to review this part on the calculation of comparative advantage a little bit more. Comparative advantage goes to the country that has to give up the least, that is, has the lowest opportunity costs. Vitally important for you to get this in this last unit of our semester. And with that, we are going to stop for the day. I'm not sure if there's an assignment in Canvas or not. You better check just to make sure, and we'll talk to you later.